This is Rock and Roll All Night and Part of Every Day with KSS Node. That's actually not a KISS quote, per se. Oh man, if I had audio. But it's a Paul Rudd quote, which is rock and roll all night and party every day. I don't really only have like so many set hours that I can party. Well, I have got errands to run, so I can only party like part of the day. So, anyway. This is not working out. Let's go. Cool. My name is Zack Hawkins. I work for a company called MediaCurrent. We build large-scale Drupal websites. I'm the theming manager there, so I worry about front-end stuff and making sure all that goes smoothly. I'm that Zack Hawkins on Twitter. I did tweet a link to my slides earlier. There's not a whole lot of slides. It's mostly demo. But let's get on into it. So KSS Node, has anyone heard of that before? Any ideas? Besides Paul and maybe Chris? No? Anyone heard of Pattern Lab? Okay. All right, cool. So it's a style guide generator, basically. So let's back up a little bit. And this, my first slide is just like, style guide generator? What's the point? Why do you need a style guide? Like, what purpose does that serve? As you know, they come out of, or they may be relevant right when they launch, but after that, they kind of like, you throw them out the window because everything changes and they don't change with it. So how is a style guide used, or why is it important? Like, how do you add a new feature to a new to you site? So this is a site that you've already built, and or maybe you've inherited, and you have no idea where stuff is, and you don't know what already exists, and they're asking you to build something new. So they're like, hey, this is our website, we want this thing, which is kind of similar to other stuff, but different enough it might be its own thing. And I used to work for Online Athens, so this is not me just like digging at Online Athens. So let me just ask you all that then. So any of you, if you inherit a site and you need to build something new, like how do you figure out if you're what you're gonna build, if it's gonna be new or if you're gonna try to reuse existing CSS or existing markup? Like, how would you approach it? Anybody?
Case-driven.
Case-driven?
Yeah, it depends on what it is you're looking at.
All right, so this thing.
Okay, I would probably copy the markup and then just alter it as I need it.
Well, this doesn't exist yet. This is just a, let's see, it's a JPEG inside of a Word document.
Yeah, like if you have similar. Yeah, we have on this already. There is. Yeah, I mean, it kind of looks like you already have something similar to that little like scroll thing, and I don't know.
Right. So your answers are basically, let's go through the site, see what already exists out there that is kind of similar, and maybe we can take it and maybe modify it, or maybe we'll just look up and click on enough pages that we can find it.
I mean, I doubt it looking at that thing, but yeah.
Yeah. All right. So then you're like, okay, cool. So this thing down here in the corner, that's kind of similar. Let's go maybe just check the CSS and see if somebody left some comments about like, hey, if there's other additional views or anything like that. So here's the actual CSS from that site. So let's just start at the top and see if you can find that thing. Do you find it yet? Hold on. Wait, there's some more. Hold on. What line is this? Oh, wait. I really want to get to the bottom. Finally got to the bottom. Right. That's probably it right there. And I wrote a lot of this stuff, so I'm not pointing fingers at anyone. This is a lot of the stuff that I wrote, and this is a few years ago. I don't write like this anymore, but yeah, all in one line. And this is not... This is like before Sass was a thing, so this is like straight CSS. So I was writing like this on purpose because I thought it was cool to have it all on one line. which was great. And that was before Git too, because I mean, if you made like a change here, good luck finding it. All right.
Those are all based on IDs.
Oh yeah, we're trying our best to like just find whatever DOM elements there are in IDs, and we're just trying to match that so that no one can ever change anything in the markup, and the CSS will still look the same. So let's check the CSS maybe. No, that didn't work too well. All right, so let's talk about KSS Node then. So KSS Node is implementation of Nile style sheets. I guess KNI or KNY. Anyways, the guy who originally created it said that name was a joke, and he didn't really mean for anyone to take it seriously. Good times. So it's a documentation syntax that's intended to be readable for humans and machines. So you write these comments, and then a machine can also read them, or other humans can read them, and the machine can generate a style guide using those comments. So human readable using specific KSS syntax comments, and a tool automatically builds a style guide based on those comments in your style sheet. So let's just look at plain KSS. Maybe, possibly. Yeah, mouse would have been nice. All right, so I've got just a plain KSS directory up here. There it is. All right, so there's really not a lot in it. This is really small. There's really not a lot in it now. There's just a components folder, and within that, we have just a CSS file. CSS file with some KSS comments in it. We've got a Twig file. That's just our kind of example markup. And we have a homepage.markdown, which will be used for the homepage of our website, or for our style guide. There's also node modules, because I didn't want to do that during a demo. That seems like a bad idea. So let's check it out. All right, so I'm sitting right in that directory too. You could install KSS globally as a node module. This talk won't really go over that. There is a link within the slides that's getting started with like Node and NPM, and that's probably more where you should look if you're not familiar with like running a node commands on the command line. You can install it globally. That's bad news bears. So instead, I'm just going to point to the node modules, KSS executable, and let's just make sure it works. Yeah, cool. So it's giving me arguments that I need to pass in to actually build it out. So there's something specific with like building. I can clone one, and we'll look at that in a second. There's also different things that I need to pass in. So if I want a CSS file to be used by the style guide, like maybe the styles of the rest of my CSS. If there's JavaScript, cool. All this other stuff too. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's actually do something. So KSS has these themes, essentially, that are called builders that are used to build your style guide. So think of them as like the source files or templates, exactly, that are used to, they're generating all your style guide flat HTML pages. So any updates you make to the flat HTML would be wiped out, and you would actually need to make the updates to the original source template builder files. So by default, KSS has they have a clone builder right up top that if you run that one, it will just create a brand new builder for you, and you can customize that to your liking. The default one uses handlebars templates, and we're not really a big fan of that because we like Drupal. So we like Twig. So there is a Twig builder now, but it is new it's new enough that they don't have a clone command for the Twig builder that I could find yet. So instead, I'm just copying the Twig builder into a builder directory right here. And let's look and see what that builder looks like. Builder, there we go. All right, so it's got some assets in it, and that's just images and stuff used for the style guide. This is the actual builder file that extends the right things and makes it work. Don't worry about that one. The index.twig, this is that source template that all your files will be built based on. And you can see at the very top, there's this styles variable right here. So whenever you pass in style, a style sheet reference within that KSS command, it's going to make sure that your style sheet is included right here. And there's also JavaScript at the bottom as well. So, scripts. Yeah, they're there. So if you pass it in JavaScript, it will also make sure that these new generated flat style guide pages also include whatever JavaScript you want. And let's take a look at, so that's pretty much the builder. It's just a template. And this is where you would modify it if you need to modify anything. It's a template that goes and creates your flat file style guide for you. And let's take a look at the KSS. Comments. All right, so this is buttons, buttons.css. And these are KSS specific comments that we're going to use and that KSS will read to then build stuff. So at the very top, that's the title of whatever we want the comment or whatever we want this component to be named. And the style guide, second one, second part there is the description. So whatever we want to say about it, usage is usually what I put in there. The markup buttons.twig, we're pointing it to that buttons.twig twig file. So we're saying we want you to use this little template here to render out this component. And then these are called modifiers. So as we're documenting this component, we might want to just add a different class and make it look a little different, right? So, you know, primary, secondary, etc., how it looks when it's disabled, how it looks when it's hovered, and so on and so forth. And KSS will actually, for every component within your style guide, it'll go through and it'll read your modifiers and it will re-render that component within your style guide again using that modifier. So say by default, buttons, you know, the button markup doesn't have any modifiers, right? By default, it just renders the first time. And then the second time, KSS will go through and say, all right, now I'm going to add the primary class, and then I'm going to render it again with remove class, and I'm going to render it again to show what it looks like when it's hovered and so on. So you don't have to manually do that. You just let KSS know what the modifiers are, and it'll re-render it with those modifier classes for you, and we'll see exactly how that works. And the very last part is where we're documenting what section it goes in, right? So style guide, that's just kind of universal, but the components, so we're saying we want this to go in a component section, and we actually, and the actual name of this section is going to be buttons. So components, buttons, and we'll see how that renders out in a second. So let us render that one out, and come back. No, other way. Yeah. All right, so let's run this thing. Whoa. All right. So this command, we're basically just pointing it at KSS. We're telling it to look inside the components directory. We're saying whenever you're done, put the new style guide within this file, or within this directory, this style guide, and then use this builder, so our new builder that we just created, in order to build this thing. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and pass in our CSS so that stuff looks right and renders. And we're going to use the verbose tag just so that it gives us all this stuff so that you can tell and kind of troubleshoot like what's actually happening. So here it's kind of like writing out what it's doing, where it found components, and what pages it's building.
Can you explain Builder or what Builder is again?
Yeah, Builder is the templates. So Builder is your style guide theme, basically. You're just pointing it at like, hey, I want to use this theme to build the style guide, essentially. And it'll, so style guides can have different look and feels. You can find different builders or themes for KSS Node as well on GitHub. So if you wanted another one to plug in, just point it at that one instead, and then it'd have a different look and feel to it.
But the point would be maybe to create a branded one.
Right. So the point is to like customize it to your liking. We have built one that come back. So we've built one that just over time has kind of evolved into, you know, adding little things that we like. I'll show you ours later, and maybe talk about the updates we've done to it.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go for it.
Do you run 100% of your CSS through this, or just things that would be more componentized?
It's better to run 100%. We do. What I end up doing is copying over all the CSS that I need from Contrib or anything like that and overriding it to point to it within the theme directory. Yeah, go big or go home. Everyone talks about it, but not very many people do it. But yes, go big or go home. So everything has a single source of truth, and you can look in the theme to find all CSS on the site. So that, anyway, that's probably a different talk.
Okay.
But
Can I ask a follow-up question?
yeah, go for it.
Since this is a node task, can you maybe have this part of your maybe Sass build process in Gulp or something?
That is a very good question. Yes, and yes, you can. And yes, we'll look at that in a second. Okay. All right, so here's what it built. Look at this. It used my homepage.markdown file to generate this. And this is just a copy of the node demo, and this is the default theme that comes with the node demo. And here's that buttons file that we were looking at. So by default, you know, nothing, kind of plain. Then it reran it again with that same markup file and added a primary modifier with description, and then reran it again and again and again and so on. And let's look at this. Let's look at this again, I guess, here. So we've got our button colors. Let's look at that actual markup file that we're pointing it to. So this is that markup file that KSS is using to render it. And most of it is, you know, it's pretty straightforward, except for this modifier class. Can you guess where that comes in? So every time KSS reruns that build, or reruns it for each modifier, it's going to insert your modifier class into whatever that variable is. So that's how KSS knows, or that's how your styles that you're setting in KSS comments are reflected on here.
I've got another question.
No, go for it.
Sorry, I'm going to
No, that's fine.
ask too many questions, but the modifiers, that doesn't include states.
It does, in kind of a hacky way. No. Let's see.
Do you actually have to hover to get the states?
Well, it should. I think they might have broke something in the latest build. But yeah, there's extra JavaScript that goes in and forces these for whenever you use active, disabled, or hover. But to be honest, most of the time disabled, I do use disabled and maybe active, but for hover, I'll just let people actually hover over them and see what they do. Yep, alrighty. So that is just plain old KSS Node, no Drupal, anything like that. Kind of platform, agnostic, right? So you could use it with anything. Use it with WordPress, use it with Drupal, use it with any front-end project that you want. And we've used it with success on Drupal 7, but there's been a pain point there where since we didn't have Twig, we'd have markup that existed within the style guide, so the sample markup templates that we see, but didn't exist within Drupal. So that was kind of the pain point, and that's where Drupal 8 has really helped out, and we'll kind of take a peek into how that works. Where's my arrow? There it is. All right.
So your Twig templates for this, you've got every component as a Twig template in your theme? Did I understand that correctly?
That is accurate. Yep, so let's look at that.
Wow.
So I've got a different theme.
Jesus. You use like a boilerplate or something so you get all of the standard stuff first?
Yeah, look at Zen. So the most recent Zen. John Alban Wilkins is maintainer of KSS Node, and he's also the maintainer of Zen as well. And in their Drupal 8 dev theme, they've got KSS like all built out. So it's pretty complex. But like you said, there's a lot of Drupal specific stuff that he's ported in there. And that's usually what we end up doing too for stuff like breadcrumbs and pagers and so on, is just copy the Drupal markup and everything into the theme, and the same with messages and stuff like that, just copy it in there. Because a lot of that is broken up so well now that it's abstracted enough that it's real easy to modify it as you need to. And as long as your data looks the same on both sides, like there's no issues. The data is a good question too, so let's look into this. All right, so we've got a theme directory here. Oh man, this is gonna be tough to see. Let's see. Let's see if there's some other way that we could actually find it. Maybe a little bit better. Let's use Drupal VM for this. So this is Drupal 8. Let's do standard Drupal 8 install. I've got our custom theme here. Called it Taco Cat. And here's how we've got it set up. I've already installed node modules. We've got a gulp file. We'll look at that in a second. Normal stuff. We've got a source and a dist folder. So that's a little bit different, but I think it works out really well. And we also have the standard Drupal 8 info.yaml, libraries.yaml, and .theme files. So let's look in our source directory, and within that, I've got them broken up into templates, which is the Drupal templates. Drupal will only scan it'll only scan for Twig templates within a templates directory, so it won't scan anywhere else for Twig template. That's the only ones it'll pick up. There's a style guide where the builder we were just talking about, the KSS theme, that's where it's sitting. Layout, that's kind of a SMACS thing, so we break up components and layout because they're two kind of separate different things in SMACS, so we break them up into two separate folders. We've got some components here too, and global, this is kind of like where I stick stuff that is used site-wide that's not specific to a component. So base stuff, this is basically normalized.css broken up a little bit. Your normal base styles that you would include everywhere, so global stuff. And then utilities, which you're going to include into whatever Sass file that you're creating in order to have access to all the mixins or variables or whatever you need. All right, so now we'll look at our components folder, and I've got a button one, and I've got an icons one, and that's a little different, and I've got a teaser one. And I also have a styleguide.markdown file, so that's the same thing as that homepage.markdown file. It's going to be used to build that main landing index page of the style guide. And it needs to be here. It needs to be somewhere that KSS is scanning. You can't just have it off in a separate directory and expect KSS to find it. KSS has to be scanning the directory that you have it in order to pick it up, which I guess that kind of makes sense, right? All All right, let's see. So let's take a look at the gulp file kind of first off. Gulp file, I've condensed a lot of these. Well, I thought I had. I guess I hadn't. A lot of these things, this one is the main one. This looks really complex, so let's go down the list. The first KSS part, this is the exact same thing basically that we ran on the command line, except now it looks a little more broken up, right? So source, I'm telling it to look at all these directories. So if there happen to be comments somewhere else in another directory, I'm not catching those, but but I know that those are the only directories that will have Sass or CSS files with KSS comments. The destination, that's of course where it's going to be built out to. The builder, that's again the builder that we're going to use. The namespace is so that if we want to include one Twig file within a component from another component, we can do an @theme name and not have to have the complete path to whatever the Twig file is. And we'll see an example of that too. Extend Drupal 8. This is important because Drupal 8 by default has a lot of great Drupal specific Twig filters like T, trans, and a lot of the other fun stuff that isn't Twig specific. So extend Drupal 8 basically puts placeholder functions there so that whenever KSS Node gets to those, it doesn't just break. It just returns whatever it is. Verbose, that's just so we can see everything. And then CSS, this is where we're actually adding our CSS files so that it's using the same CSS files that we're using within Drupal. This is probably the most painful part. What I have done in the past is just had all the CSS compiled to one file as a build step process. And just include that one file so that whenever it is updated, you don't have to come and muck around in this part. You just kind of have your all.css file. That brings with it its own difficulties, but it does save some time here. And JavaScript as well. So I've just got an example of JavaScript. There it is. And here's how it knows what file to look for the home page. Style guide.markdown, and this is the title of it. So at the very top, it'll show stuff. All right, and I've got some other stuff too that's not super relevant. It's just mainly deleting the dist folder, watching, and then if it sees any Twig files that are changed, then run the style guide stuff again. And then I've also got just compile Sass in here just for fun. I've really kind of narrowed it down. So there's not a ton of stuff in there. All right. So let's see. Let us just try to run that thing and see what it looks like. All right, so I'll make sure I'm typing correctly. All right, so I'm within that theme folder. I use NVM to manage my version of Node, just because we have a lot of projects that span different versions of Node. And I've also kind of, you could just run gulp globally. We don't do that for other reasons. Ask me after all this is said and done if you care. And so I'm going to run my build command. So the build command is basically just going to run gulp and all the default tasks that I have for gulp. And this is just specific to my project. So it's going to run, it's going to say gulp. Whoa, and look, it did a lot of stuff. All right, so here's the KSS part. If you didn't have verbose on, you wouldn't see all this mess. But so it's showing where it's finding stuff, you know, the destination, so on. The namespace it's using and all the comments that it found. And then it goes on and tells you what it's doing and says, hey, we're all done. All right, let's see. So, yay, now we have a style guide called Taco Cat. Taco Cat style guide. All right, so got some components in here. I've even kind of got another component demo that we'll look at in a second. I've done a lot. This is from a recent project. I created a little macro that basically just would include an SVG. icon. And so I've got it documented in the style guide because that seemed like a good place for it. And it's its own section here, and layout stuff is a little bit different. And let's see, colors, got it documented here as well. And type, we also have documented. And what's been really helpful to me is having colors documented with the Sass variable name, so you can find this, copy and paste it into the theme. And I use that way more than going to whatever the partial is and referencing it there. And the type one too, I also include a mixin for that. So if you wanted to just like copy and paste and get like a certain font stack, you could. All right, let's see.
I've got another question.
No, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Under the colors, those are those showing the RGB or the hex values because you've done your color variables in hex?
Those are actually hard coded. There was, I thought, was a smart way to do it, but it ended up not being smart on the end. So we'll look at that in a second. That's a good question. But first, let's just actually make sure this is working. So for an example, let's just update the home page because I forgot to give the oatmeal credit for this awesome taco cat image. Like, isn't that cool? That's a t-shirt. That could be your t-shirt if you went to theoatmeal.com. And let's look in our source components and then our style guide. And there's my taco cat t-shirt. So let's update and give credit to the oatmeal. And let's run it again. And you don't have to run the whole build. I could have just run the KSS command, but might as well. So let's see if it updated. Taco cat. Now we got credit link to the oatmeal. Sweet. All right, so that works. All right, so let's look at colors and type real quick. So components. Colors is within global. Is that global? Oh man. Global, and then my utilities, and then colors is within here. And earlier we saw how you could point KSS at a specific markup file for a component. You could also inline all that stuff, and it'll also work. It's not fantastic, but for strict documentation purposes like this, it's worked out pretty well because this is not something that you really care about. This is more just building it out so that you have reference to it. So here I'm actually, I've pretty much just got them hard-coded. These are Sass comments, right? So we've got everything commented out in Sass comments, so those don't actually get rendered whenever it's built out to CSS. You could do CSS comments, which we did in the earlier KSS, just strict KSS demo. If you did it with CSS comments, you could have that variable be built within the markup and then have it use that. You could. And that would work. So then all of this nonsense where I'm hard coding the hex code, like you wouldn't need to do that. To me, it was just easier just to keep everything a little consistent, but that is something I think, like if you did want to have it be real so that whenever you populated this, it would actually change the color. And then in type, kind of doing the same thing. So utilities, typography, doing the same thing here where I've got my mixins and stuff all within the same file. And I've got my hard-coded markup that just has examples of whatever I'm trying to show. And here, we haven't really touched on this yet, but those sections that you see on the right side of the style guide, you can custom weight those to move them around. So I've got type all the way at the bottom because I set a really high number, and that's more because I want all the utility stuff kind of sitting at the bottom and all the components to sit at the top, because to me that was important. All right, and So we'll look at in a second at like the data part, but let's say the CSS part is pretty straightforward, right? So if I include CSS file, it's going to be the same CSS file that I'm using on my actual site, so that if any CSS changes are made, then it'll be reflected in both places, or broken in one place and reflected in both places, right? What about JavaScript though? So how do I deal with like Drupal specific JavaScript within the style guide that also needs to render in Drupal? Because Drupal, you can run just a document.ready and then do a ton of stuff, and that'd run just fine in KSS, just on the flat style guide part. But what if you had, say, behaviors, and you care about that, or Drupal settings, and you're trying to get stuff out of Drupal settings? Like, how do you deal with that? Well, I'll show you how I deal with it. So let's look in our style guide folder at our builder, and this is kind of the builder that I've customized a little bit, the index.twig. And at the very bottom, look at that. So I've got a fake Drupal settings with fake data. So this data would mirror whatever Drupal would actually spit out on the bottom. And we've done this before for specific components that needed specific thing, and you wanted to show it in the style guide as well. Well, now you can. We're referencing cores jQuery just because can, once just in case someone uses .once. The DOM ready stuff with Drupal 8 core, the settings loader so the settings work, and Drupal.js so that behaviors fire. So this means all of a sudden Drupal JavaScript behaviors work in the style guide as well as Drupal. So you can write just Drupal behaviors for JavaScript just one time and use it in both places. And let's see, I think I have an example of that. Components. I'm really just guessing. I can't read any of that stuff.
I can read it for you.
That'd be very helpful.
What do you? Teaser.js.
Yes, fantastic. All right, so within this teaser directory for this component, I've got it broken up into a JSON file we'll talk about in a second. Teaser.js, so JavaScript specific for the component. Teaser.css, so CSS specific for the component with the KSS comments in it. And a teaser.twig, which is the actual markup. So within here, I've got JavaScript behavior, and it's doing the normal Drupal stuff, which is attach, passing in context and settings. And then I'm just console logging settings so you can see that it's actually running. So hopefully it will actually run, and I won't look quite the fool. All right, so let's see. Whoa. Look at that. It did run. There it is. Right there. That's our data from our Drupal settings that we're just console logging out. So, same JavaScript, both sides. Drupal.js doesn't care where it is. It's going to run regardless. So pretty neat. So that's how it, previously, before we took this approach, we used to have like specific JavaScript for the style guide, which was not the best. But now, since we're just running Drupal.js on both sides, you can use the same JavaScript on both sides and it runs just fine. All right, so let's look at the most exciting part of this. Y'all don't seem very excited, but I know you are. Like I know Chris is excited at least. Yeah. All right, let's check this out. All right, so earlier, you remember that modifier class that we saw, right? Let's look at this teaser component. So it looks like teaser component looks like this. I've got my title, my description, and the rendered markup of what it looks like. And if you wanted to show a markup example, we could. And it's populating with data somehow. I wonder how. And here's the actual file, the teaser.twig file. And here you can see there's actual twig variables within it. The modifier.class we talked about earlier, that's so that if we had different modifiers, KSS would generate this again for each modifier. So you'd have different colors and such. But the other ones, like that's kind of curious. turns out if you have a teaser.json, so the same name as whatever the Twig file's name is, it will use that data to render the template. So all of a sudden now we can like kind of structure our data and set up dummy data. So here's kind of our placeholder data here, you know, that's what's using. It's using the title, description, URL, image, and button. And notice that I'm rendering the whole image tag here, and we'll talk about that in a second. And it's populating. Look at that. It's populating all that fun stuff. All right, cool. So that's kind of neat. What can we do with that? What if, since this is Twig, what if we could include this file from a Drupal file and pass in the values that we needed to render this? So what would that give us? That would give us a single source of truth. So that would give us this one piece of markup as a single source of truth for every time that markup is used throughout Drupal, right? So if you changed this here, it would be reflected wherever you included that file, you know, everywhere. So your style guide really would be one-to-one with your site because they're using the exact same markup.
Can you show the JSON file? I just want to carry to the image.
I'll get to it. Yeah, so it's just using a placeholder image URL, but it is the whole image tag. Yeah. And we'll talk about that shortly. All right, so cool. Let's actually look at is that Drupal VM, maybe? Look, here's Drupal. Look, here's our component. Exactly the same as our style guide. How neat. How did that happen? Let's check it out. So this is using the teaser view mode. And I've got a specific template for the teaser view mode. So within Drupal templates, the only thing that Drupal's going to read, we've got a node teaser. And look at that. So it's including, and that's that funny little at our theme name, and then path to the component with, and then this is where we're passing the values in. So on the right side is the Drupal values, and on the left side are the values that will be available within the template. So here we're just straight passing in the URL. If we had a modifier class, we pass that into the title and so on, the body description. The image, we're taking Drupal's rendered image and passing it through. So earlier when we were seeing that we mocked up just the straight, you know, image tag, that's because we're going to leverage Drupal for creating that image tag, responsive images, you know, all that fun stuff. So we don't have to recreate that in Twig and just pass it straight through to the template. And the very last, you know, I've got a custom field called call to action so you could override the text. And here you can see I'm doing some funkiness to actually get at the real value. There's modules that are under work now that will make that a little straightforward with the Twig filter. But for this purpose anyway, this is how we're using one Twig file with Drupal so we have a single source of truth. So say you had like a modifier for this, like you had this exact same thing, but maybe slightly differently. Maybe, I don't know, the image was on one side instead of underneath. And you can do all that with a CSS class. So maybe you had a different display mode that controlled that, or some other variable that controlled that. So if you had a different display mode for it, you'd have node -- teaser 2 or whatever. You could include this same thing and then just pass it a different modifier class. So it's doing the same thing, still single source of truth, but just it'll look completely different. Well, as different as you want it to look.
From the field overriding the image, the placeholder.
Right, so whenever it's including these, it's going to pass in the Drupal values into the Twig template, and then the Twig template will render that out.
But how does it know which one to use?
Well, if it's not KSS, Drupal just sees that it's a Twig template. Drupal doesn't know about KSS, and KSS doesn't know about Drupal. Whenever KSS runs, KSS sees that JSON file, so that's how it knows what dummy data to use. But that JSON file, Drupal doesn't care. Like, Drupal doesn't scan anything outside of the templates directory. So it doesn't matter. It's never going to find that or use that for anything. It's just going to use whatever values are passed to it. And this with only tag here, this is so we're only exposing these values within that template. It's like a context thing, so you're not exposing like all of that view mode's variables within that template. And that's just kind of, I've heard it described as giving you less rope to hang yourself with. All right, so very last thing. So how does the CSS get added? We know how it's added in KSS. It's in KSS we had to like custom, point it at the right place. Drupal 8, it's way easier. Drupal libraries are like my new favorite thing in Drupal 8. So by default, we've got some global stuff that's included. Global is included everywhere. This is loaded on every page. In our main info file, we're pointing out that hey, here's the libraries on our info file. These need to be loaded everywhere. It's got a web fonts and a global, and none of the other libraries are loaded. So I've got several other libraries here, but none of them are loaded. And check this out. You can declare dependencies on other libraries. So what that means is if teaser library is ever loaded or attached, it knows that it needs the button library loaded before it in order to work properly. We're using button styles there, right? We got button classes. Well, we don't need to have them like in the same file or anything like that. We can just make sure that the dependencies are sorted out right, and Drupal will make sure that that's loaded first and that comes next. So you can just attach one library and let it go. So how are we attaching those libraries? All right, let's look at it. Go back to our actual component twig. At the very top, we're using attach library to do that. So that's Drupal 8 specific. It's telling Drupal that whenever you find this twig template, attach this library. So because we're including that twig template within the node file, within the node view mode, node teaser, it's including this template, and by doing that, Drupal finds this attached library, and it's attaching the library. And because we declare the dependency on button, Drupal is going to go ahead and attach the button library as well, just to make sure that it comes first, and then our teaser one. So through attached library, we're able to make sure that the CSS or JavaScript, if you had JavaScript for this, that's needed for this component is only attached where it needs to attach. So what that means is if you're on the home page and you have a teaser on there and you're including this template, it's going to attach the library and your CSS is going to be there in JavaScript and so on. If it isn't, then it won't, because Drupal won't know about it, because Drupal isn't including the twig file, so Drupal is also not attaching any libraries for it. So we get much better as far as like loading only the assets we need and not including just a main.css that includes the world of Java or CSS, everything, even if we're only using like 25% of it for any given page. Yeah, attached libraries.
Look, when you say that, okay, so CSS not typically so big, right? But if you can get it all into a single file and minify it, doesn't that negate any gains that you would have, because now you're loading all these CSS files and you're just depending on what Drupal to concatenate them all?
Yeah, so we're letting Drupal aggregate them together, right? And minify them and be smart about its bundles that it's building per page. But yes, while you do raise a good point, I would counter with HTTP 2 and multiple requests will get to be less expensive. So it gets much more beneficial to include multiple CSS file requests as you need them versus include like everything at the get-go. Mainly because even though CSS is relatively small file-wise, I mean, there's still a lot of parsing that needs to go there, right? So the browser has to go through and paint everything and like scan through all that to paint it. So it's the same JavaScript argument too, where people are like, well, if you're worried about the size of JavaScript, then just don't include an image and then that will be fine. Well, yeah, for the file size, but that doesn't do anything for the parse time. You know, so the browser still has to parse all that junk and figure out what needs to happen. So the less you can include, the better. So yeah, I definitely feel where you're coming from, and I have the same concerns as well. But I definitely feel like this is the path forward, I guess. But yes, you could certainly include just main.css and then not worry about attached libraries, because everything would always have your CSS. But I really like attached libraries and making only what's needed available. And I just feel like it's also kind of sad, or not sad, but dangerous to rely on browser caching stuff. You know, because if they get refreshed twice, then that throws the cache out the window. You know, so cache is nice, but I feel like relying on it as kind of part of your overall performance thing is maybe dangerous, I guess. And let's see if we have any more slides. Do we? Maybe. Yeah, all right, so I've got some links to get you started. And this is part of what I tweeted out earlier as well. KSS Node, the GitHub one, there's a quick start, which is actually pretty good. Quick start guide, and also an intro to Node and NPM if you're not familiar. And let's see, and there's my slides. And that's it. Thank you.